If you're somebody who's making the case for Christianity and you're passionate about that, and there's a lot of us out there who are tent makers, guys and gals who are involved in other disciplines, other professions, but they have a real passion for making a case for Christianity. I think now is the time for tent-making Christian apologists to step forward and actually become very active. And the target group, I think, the group we should be putting in our sights first and foremost should be young Christians in the junior high, high school, and college years. Those are the places where, and really the ages in which I think young people really are challenged in a way that people my age aren't challenged. And if you look at the statistics, people my age don't leave the church nearly as often as young people in the 14 to 30 range. The attrition rate in the church is pretty dramatic, and we can address it if we. This is why I wrote the book. A lot of it just came out of my experience as a youth pastor, and having taught these materials to young people for years. I was with Sean McDowell on a missions trip, and I was teaching this content, and he said, you should write a book about that.
Really?
And that's how the whole thing started.
Josh McDowell's son encouraged.
Yeah, it was his
cold case Christianity.
We can blame him for this because that's how it got started.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
And I'm excited. We'll be telling you about the little booklet, Alive, a cold case approach to the resurrection. J. Warner Wallace. What a marvelous tool. We want to give you 4 at a time for a gift of $25 or more so that you have it, and then you can share it with your friends, co-workers, family members who, like Josh McDowell, like Lee Strobel, who did your foreword on the book, like you, we're close to the issues of faith. And in fact, I want to pull out a quote you love to use.
Sure.
And I'm not sure, but I think Richard Dawkins' expression is very similar to what you felt at one time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take a look. We're going to put this on the screen for you. He said, faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence.
Now that to me was, oh my gosh, yes. Not only that did I think that way, I would have said I think that Christians in many ways are kind of dangerous. Because if you're going to embrace an overarching metaphysical view, which colors and shapes every decision you make, yet you're embracing it without the need to look at any evidence to see if it's actually true, I think that's a very poor way to come to truth claims. And if that's the case, I certainly don't want someone like that running for office and making decisions about public policy or about what war we should enter or not enter, if they're not the kind of person who looks at the evidential case for either doing or not doing something, believing or not believing something. So I would have said as an atheist that this, and I think Richard captures it just perfectly, and I would have very much affirmed that kind of. Now, it turns out, as I read through the Gospels for the first time, what I was so intrigued by was the evidential nature of Jesus. The fact that he would always come into a city and provide evidence for belief and then preach behind that evidence. So for example, he would say often in the Gospel of John, if you don't believe what I'm telling you, at least believe on the evidence of the miracles I've offered you. And then for 40 days with the apostles in the book of Acts chapter 1, he spends 40 days, it says in Acts 1 verses 2 and 3, giving the apostles additional proofs, many convincing proofs. And I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute, now you've just risen from the dead. Okay, how much more do I really need after the resurrection? But apparently he wanted to offer 40 more days of convincing proofs. Then, when it's time to select a replacement for Judas, they're in the upper room in Acts chapter 1. And how do they pick that guy? Well, they say, we need somebody who can testify as an eyewitness who saw everything from the baptism to the resurrection. We're looking for eyewitnesses. And it turns out, when they share the gospel throughout the entire book of Acts, they do it in the same way. They say, hey, you know what? The Old Testament predicted this stuff, and we saw Jesus rise from the dead with our own eyes. We're here to testify to the resurrection. The raw evidential nature of Christianity was so powerful. As a matter of fact, as a skeptic, who, we might say to your son if he's having doubts, you might say, oh, well, you just need to trust more, you need to pray about it. That's not what Jesus did. When John had doubts, John the Baptist, and he sent his disciples to Jesus, and John's in captivity. And his disciples come and say, hey, John sent us, and he wants to know, are you the one? I'm sure Jesus at the time might have felt like, oh my gosh, really? Okay. What does he do? He doesn't go and tell the disciples, go back and have John pray about him. He needs to have deeper faith. No, he says, hang on a minute. He does miracles in front of John's disciples, and he says, go back and tell John what you saw. So Jesus clearly takes an evidential approach to belief. It's not belief in spite of evidence. It's not belief in lieu of evidence. It's trust because of the evidence. And this is what he always would say. And this is why you see this pattern of healings and preachings, where now my words have merit because you've seen who I am. You've seen what I can do. And that was very powerful to me as somebody who was a skeptic, who was an evidentialist, who wanted to, could never embrace a view that required me to turn off that part of my mind. And it turns out this is the one, or what, this is really the theistic worldview that is verifiable or falsifiable based on whether or not this thing happened. Did the resurrection occur? And because it's an event that occurs in a fixed point in time in the past, like all of my cold cases, we can actually apply some of these techniques we use in cold cases to look at the resurrection. And that's what I tried to do in both Alive and in Cold Case.
Fabulous little book. I so appreciate it. Now, you say it takes about 2 years to solve your average cold case.
Yeah.
And they're old.
Yeah, and sometimes I say 2 years because we may have staged it for 3 or 4 prior to that. It may have been on our list of cases we want to get to, and we might just kind of chip at it for a few years, and then eventually we say, okay, this is the next case up and we're good to go. And then we'll spend 2 years. So I've been approached by television shows who have said, hey, can you come on our staff and we want to do a case a week? And I said, well,
first
of all,
kidding?
yeah, that's really not possible. And so we have to be realistic. This is not television. This is the real world, and these cases take a long time. So for me, as a Christian, a new investigator who is not yet a Christian, and really wanted to look at the evidence to see if it was true.
How long did it take?
It took a long time. And
for Jesus to convince you he was alive.
Well, for me to lay down my presuppositions against anything supernatural, for me to feel like I invested the kind of investigation I would do into anybody's cold case, I needed to make those kinds of decisions. And also I'm trying to wedge this in while I'm working cases. So I had a robust investigative life, and I would spend hours every morning I've got Bibles that are just completely scarred up with forensic statement analysis, all the different tools I would apply to the scriptures. And it took, I would say, somewhere in the 4 to 6 months or so of digging through this. And I was really poor. I mean, I was single-minded during that period of time.
You had a passion.
Yeah, I was very passionate about it.
Now tell me honestly, was the barrier more intellectual? I don't get this, I need more information. Or was it volitional? I don't want to know.
Yes, at some point I think all of us have to ask that question. Now I want to be fair, because if you were to talk to any of my atheist family members, because I'm raised in a family of really non-believers and some cultural Catholics, and my dad remarried, he's got a Mormon family. If I was in that kind of interesting mix, the non-believers I think would have said, no, this is all rational. I don't believe this because you've got no good evidence. In the end, though, we all know that we come to the table with some presupposition. Nobody comes without a presupposition. It's just the way it is. Even jurors, we ask them, can you lay down your presuppositions to do this fairly? But we understand that everyone comes in. So if you're a non-believer who's looking at a show like this, or at a program like this, or a book like that, I know that you have some presupposition, either for or against. I get that. And I think all of us have that. And in the end, those foundational things end up being really, really important, because you won't see things clearly unless you're willing to recognize what your presupposition is and suspend it long enough to look at the evidence.
Well, you've just done a masterful job, and fun. I mean, really, okay, I have to ask you this. I cannot let you leave the studio with how many years solving murder cases?
I think we've been doing it since maybe 15, or let's see, maybe close to 20 years of my career was spent working in some form of murder or another.
Now, you'd have to be living under a rock to miss the fact that there is a proliferation. I mean, I don't know, maybe within the top 3 themes on television today, murder, crimes.
Yes.
And they seem to be trying to outdo each other with graphic detail and mutilated bodies and burned bodies and parts of bodies. And I'm sorry, I've said too much already. How do you feel about this? Well, and the impact in our culture. I mean, you seem like a well-adjusted, positive guy with all the ugliness you surely have looked at over the years. What do you think about all of this permeating our culture?
Well, I do see a shift. It used to be that TV shows were focused on how we investigate, kind of the life of the detective. Now the shift is kind of to the life of the criminal.
This is not Murder, She Wrote.
Right. So it's a little bit different. But I think when you walk into any murder scene, you have three ways you can handle it. One, you can be very empathetic, in which case it's going to eventually affect you, because your heart's going to mourn for everyone in the room, both the deceased and the family and all that. It's terrible. What you see in these kinds of cases is horrific. The other thing you can do is you can become very cynical and detached from it.
Cool.
And because
No
that was a
feeling.
survival mechanism. Or the third thing you can do is to adopt a worldview that helps you make sense of the scene in front of you. And I've been through all three of these stages, okay? So I know I've done all three of these things. But right now, I would say my Christian worldview guides me in that scene, because I recognize that the body on the floor is not the victim anymore. The victim is gone. The victim is a soulish creature, because my Christian worldview gives me a strong footing in substance dualism. That's the idea that we're not just bodies, we're bodies and souls. So the person on the floor anymore, I'm able to not grieve the way I used to grieve, because I recognize that we have a thing called eternal life. And my Christian worldview actually now helps me to deal with the crime scene. So there's three ways, I think, to handle it. And as Christians, I hope we're all allowing our Christian beliefs to change the way we look at the world. And that's the strength of believing in Christianity and having a strong reason to believe, an evidential reason to believe. We're not like Richard Dawkins says. We don't believe blindly or in spite of the evidence. We have a trust that's informed by the evidence. That's the kind of definition of the Christian worldview.